Are we live? Looks like we're live. Hello, Internet world. Good to see you for today's Brown Bags and Bibles. I'm Scott Wakefield, lead pastor here at First Christian Church. Really glad you've joined us, as we are always joined by the beekeeper, Mark
Yes,
Liebert.
as best I can. Yes, hi, Mark Liebert. I'm one of the elders here.
What's this beekeeper
I
thing?
am a beekeeper. I'm a backyard beekeeper. We need more of that.
We need more bees, is what we need.
Yes, and backyard beekeepers help with that.
Backyard beekeepers with brown bags and Bibles, who are breaking down life's biggest befuddlements with biblical basics.
Oh boy.
As we do on Tuesdays. So really glad you've joined us today. We've got a hot topic.
Mhm.
It's one we're all seeing about, writing about, reading about, watching videos about, all over the internet.
Yeah.
So we're going to be talking today about George Floyd, racism, riots, and justice.
Mhm.
So a little background, in case you are not as absurdly connected to the internet world as I am as an info hound. Let's set the scene for folks to give a little bit of context about what's been going on the last couple-ish weeks.
Yeah.
I can't remember exactly the day this happened, but the George Floyd tragedy was
Memorial Day. I can't remember.
Memorial Day.
I thought so. I'll check.
Huh. That's good. Why don't you check on that? And I'll keep giving a little bit of context, and then we'll jump into a number of questions related to this. So
It was May 25th, whatever date that was.
May 25th. Okay. So we're a little more than maybe 2 weeks now. By the way, we're going to be talking about a biblical perspective, setting some context, giving some biblical perspective for the first half, and then the second half we'll interact with your questions. So jump in, give us a shout out. It's good to see you all. Whole bunch of y'all jumping on now. Good to see you, Michael, Alicia, Leslie, David, Nathan, Angela, and a bunch of other names.
So the 25th was Memorial Day.
Oh, it was? Okay.
Yes.
All right. On the 25th, we'll give some context, we'll give a biblical perspective, and then we'll interact with your questions. So share and like, and let other folks know what's going on. So you want to set some context?
Sure.
All right.
Yeah. This is a touchy and a difficult topic. So, I mean, what you're looking at here is a couple of white men. So
Yes, this is true.
Let's just state that from the outset. We are not experts on all these matters, and we certainly don't pretend to know what it's like to grow up as not a white man.
I don't know. I'm going to pretty much claim that I speak for all black people today
Sure.
right now.
I'm sure you will.
Yeah.
But I think that's important for us to state at the outset.
Right.
Because
Absolutely.
We have a couple perspectives that we work from. One
Sure.
is the Bible. The Bible is our source of authority and truth for all of life and practice.
Yes, we say it's sufficient.
Yes.
A lot of times we talk about the authority of Scripture, which people will give intellectual, mental assent to.
Right.
But the sufficiency of Scripture gets at the extent to which we live by its principles
Right.
and look to it for answers.
Right.
Even in things like the murder of George Floyd.
Right.
Yeah.
And then we just have the context that we know and have grown up in and have lived in. And obviously, some of you may be even listening to this or watching this thinking, I don't want to hear from you because you're white and you're male. Okay.
I'm not sure I want to hear from you.
I understand. Let's just say at the outset, we understand that. We do.
Sure.
And so we have done a lot of prayer and research and trying to prepare what we have to say from the perspective the Bible produces. And then there were four parameters that I used. I know I talked to Scott about this in preparing for this. One was I prayed a lot about this for my approach, for the country, for the healing, for everything about this. I just prayed. 1 Timothy 2 says, prayer should be offered for all those in authority, including kings. And we would argue, it says kings in all high positions, that we may live peaceful and quiet lives, godly and dignified. So the first thing I did was pray. Then choose humility. James 4:6. God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble.
Yep.
So I need to approach this from a standpoint of humility. Thirdly, identify the sin in my own heart. So Psalm 139, 23 and 24, right?
Yep.
Search me, O God. Test me, know my anxious thoughts. See if there be any offensive way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. And then lastly, trying to model our approach after Jesus,
Mm.
who is the fullness of grace and truth,
Not just
according, right,
balance, fullness of each.
John 1:14,
Yeah.
who came from the Father with a fullness of grace and truth. And it uses that phrase, grace and truth, twice,
Mm-hmm.
if you look verses 14 through 17.
Yeah.
Because people will tend to be on both sides of this, either truth or grace. And that's true for all issues of life. We either tend to see things as no, yes or no, um, pun intended, black or white.
Nice, nice.
Or grace, which is
That will be the full extent of our
puns.
race puns.
Okay,
Yes,
race
yes.
puns. And then grace
that
is
that
the
was that
opposite side.
was acceptable.
Right.
Yeah,
But I thought it was important that we start with those principles.
sure, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. So let's say, the murder of George Floyd, and we're going to call it murder because, in my mind, regardless of what the circumstances are in terms of Derek Chauvin, I guess that's how you say his
I don't
name.
know how to say his name.
Chauvin sounds Francis Chauvin. So Derek Chauvin, regardless of his knowledge of George Floyd, because apparently they worked in the same nightclub as
Yeah.
bouncers, as security or something like that. So they might have known each other, but regardless of what the relationship might have been, or Derek Chauvin's, maybe he had some racist motivation as a part of that. Maybe not. We don't know. We're hoping and praying that that's a part of the judicial process. Regardless of those things, murder is evil, yeah, and is a form of hatred.
Yeah.
And racism could have been one of those motivations.
Absolutely, could have been.
So obviously that means we're establishing at the beginning here, this is murder.
Yep.
This is wrong. And it involved a white man and a black man.
Right.
And that's a loss of life worth grieving.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, if you've watched the videos or even read a description of them,
yeah,
it's horrifying.
A number of people have said, I could watch for a few seconds, but I can't keep going.
I couldn't find myself watching the prolonged thing. I saw enough that with the knee on his neck and he's crying out for his mother.
Sure.
I mean, it's horrifying. So let's just state from the outset, as Scott said, we are grieving the loss of a human life made in the image of God that has infinite worth and value to him because it reflects his image.
And this is a theme that's come up the last few weeks. Insofar as we're able, we must grieve or celebrate, or however we want to not celebrate this, but but our perspective about situations are based on what we can know.
Yeah.
So we grieve because we can tell this much is the case. Right. The details of motivation or the relationship beforehand or Derek Chauvin, all of that has to come out in the judicial process, which doesn't mean we don't have responsibility past this, etc. But at least at this point, as it relates to that situation, we grieve it.
Right. Whether it's first, second, third degree murder, whatever it is, it's murder.
Right.
It was evil.
Yeah.
It was heinous, and we grieve the loss of a life made in the image of God. Period.
Yeah.
Just period.
Yeah. And that's the basis for human value and worth right there.
Right.
Being made in the image of God.
Right. Sure. Right. With his stamp on it. So he has a family left behind. He has a 6-year-old daughter. Mm-hmm. He has friends left behind. We need to be grieving for them and for the loss there. So, I mean, we tend to get focused on what was the situation at the time, and then look at looting or protesting that happened afterward. Fine, but let's not gloss over what happened to an image bearer of God.
Right.
It was wrong, and we grieve that.
Yeah. And the judicial and accountability process must take its
it must. Yeah. I mean, the second thing is we have to hold the officer and officers.
Yeah.
There were at least 4.
There were 3 others. Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm. Accountable for the actions because it was a horrible thing that happened. Remember, officers have great responsibility.
Yeah.
We need to be sensitive to them because they have responsibility that I don't have. Yes. They are entrusted with the authority to protect or take life.
Which is a very unique and small slice of humanity.
I do not know what that is like.
Right.
So let the judicial process run its course.
Yeah.
Yes, the one, Derek, was more involved, but the 3 who stood by, I agree that charges should be raised and they should encounter this in court. Yes, I can imagine, and again, I've not been a police officer, but I can imagine that there's a camaraderie there, and if your friend is doing something and you're questioning what your friend is doing, you may not want to override them and say, hey, stop doing that, if they have more authority or they have a stronger personality. I don't know. But in this case, a man's life is on the line.
Yeah.
So you have to step forward and say, Derek, stop. The man needs to breathe.
Right.
So in that, because of that, there's culpability
Yes.
that all of them have, even if the one has more.
Which is to say, we all have responsibility at
Yes.
whatever level of authority we have.
Yes.
Whether that's one of those four officers,
Right.
and I think the people watching, videoing, you heard some of them on the video if you watched enough, saying
Yeah,
things
they
to
were.
them. There's a sense in which they were taking responsibility that they could at the moment.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. They were trying to step in.
Which is to say, we all have a responsibility to respond in a way um, that doesn't ignore injustice.
Right. Wherever we see it. Right.
Yes.
And I know there have been those who said, don't lump all the police into the action that these four
Sure.
did.
Of course.
Absolutely, that's true. We understand that. That's true. What we're talking about here is simply the responsibility these officers had at this time. That's all we can say right now.
Yeah.
Now, are there larger issues that need to be looked at in our society? We can talk about that.
Yeah.
But here specifically, these men need to be held accountable for their action or inaction.
In fact, I think we'll probably talk about this issue for about 3 weeks. Is that cool?
Right. Because that's what it's raised in our popular consciousness, right? This is emblematic of something larger going on, and that's what we need to talk about, right? But we wanted to start with, well, wait a minute, let's say exactly what happened, who's responsible, and justice needs to be met here.
Yeah, which I think is a part of the explanation of protests,
Yeah.
peaceful protests that sometimes have devolved into rioting and looting.
Right.
So it's clearly important to make a distinction between peaceful
Right.
and criminal.
Right. Absolutely. Very different.
Yeah.
Right. And
That's different ways to take reasonable and lawful responsibility that one can
right.
and not.
Right. So the point you're making is we all have to respond to this in a godly way that doesn't ignore injustice. So a godly response is let's engage in healthy conversations on these issues.
Mm-hmm.
We can peacefully protest.
Sure.
We can write to someone in Congress. We can point out injustice where we see it. We can stand up for someone who's being mistreated. These are all things we can do where we respond in a godly way.
Right.
And I was talking to somebody ahead of time, like, well, point out that there's things people can do. We don't just say that's bad. I feel bad about that, and we go on our daily lives.
Right.
I've tried to name some specific actions we can take.
And we do have some things that we'll get to in that vein in some practical terms a little
Sure.
bit later on. Sure.
Sure.
Yeah.
But before we leave this topic of George Floyd himself, we have to agree that neither the officers or those who chose to riot, again, not the majority of the protesters, are responding in a godly way. The problem here is lawlessness.
Yes.
On all accounts, it's lawlessness from the officers.
Mm-hmm.
It is taking the law into their own hands or being a god unto themselves.
Mm-hmm.
But the rioters end up doing the same thing. It's a lack of submission to God.
Yes.
Is taking the law into your own hands, and therefore what we see by both those who initially started the problem and those who are reacting in a way that's not pleasing to God
Right.
is the same lawlessness.
We talked some about this last week.
Yes.
Yes.
That isn't the solution on either side.
Right. Quick parenthetical thought that relates to a number of these things. The frustration we feel, the brokenness of the world. I mean, the curse is real,
Yes.
right? In Genesis 3 on, God says, things are not going to work. And I think people have a sense of that that is very much a part of the motivation for why they do what they do.
Sure.
And sometimes that means going beyond
Sure.
their ability and authority to try to take the law into one's own hands.
Right. And we get the motivation, we get the anger. Yes. I was trying to think how to understand what the two did and how to compare them. So I said it this way, just in my own thinking. The officers abused their authority and their responsibility through lawlessness. They became a god unto themselves. The rioters,
Which is a way of saying something that often the black community feels like is something that they experience
yes,
in a regular kind of way, even if it's in small
right, even if it doesn't always lead
insinuations.
to loss of life,
And it doesn't, right? And it doesn't
Right.
go up
Being-
to something like
being more likely to be pulled over when you're driving at night or something
Right.
like that.
Yes.
Right. And that's important to state here.
that. Absolutely.
But I also thought so. The rioters then they protested the abuse of authority,
Yes.
but through lawlessness also.
Yes.
Again, being a god unto themselves. So
And
just trying to show that lawlessness on either end of the spectrum doesn't help.
And I think some folks who have been experiencing the what I'm going to call whether it's what we sometimes, and I'm not always a fan of this terminology because it becomes confusing, but whether we're talking about institutional
Mm-hmm.
or structural or systematic,
Mm-hmm.
which can take a whole number of forms. You have to
Right.
define that as you're talking about it.
Right.
Whether you're talking about that or you're talking about subconscious bias or
Right.
those kinds of things, whatever you're at on that range, I can understand insofar as I'm able, though I'm
Right.
obviously not black,
Right.
and then we can talk about white privilege, etc. I can understand why some of those folks who are peacefully protesting, I've seen a number of reactions. There have been some folks who are like, "Hey, rioters and looters, chill out.
Mm-hmm.
Don't take uh, my ability to rightfully make a statement by
Sure.
smashing in and stealing,
Sure.
and that's regardless of race." Um, and also, those same black people feeling like, listen, the peaceful stuff hasn't been working.
Right.
So I
Right.
understand, insofar as I'm able, we've established at the beginning we're white males.
Right.
That is a feeling, a
Sure.
sense of, well, this hasn't been working this
It's
way.
a.
So
It's, I would assume it's a feeling of helplessness.
sure,
It's
lack
a
of
feeling of
control.
despair.
Yes,
It's a feeling of I
there's no
have to do
fix.
something.
Right.
Right. I have to do something. So,
Yeah.
insofar as we are able, we understand that motivation and why it arises.
Which was an early part of Black Lives Matter.
Yep.
That I would say has been co-opted by other political forces and it's become a part of identity politics in a way that also grabs in other things. I
Yeah.
think we can get to that eventually.
Yeah.
Is there
Black
anything else?
lives. Well, I was just going to say, I was talking to someone earlier this week, and we used that term, institutional or structural or systemic racism, and the person responded back to me, "What are you talking about?" They were white,
Right.
and they had no concept. And so, just as a simple example, it would be, why is a black person more likely to be pulled over at night in their car than I would be?
Right.
So a simple example of this, my wife and I were talking about this. We read about a case where some black families were playing with their kids in the street, playing ball,
Mm-hmm.
and the soccer ball got out of the street and went into the neighbor's yard, a white neighbor's yard in their
Uh-huh.
backyard. And the father went to get it, and the mother said, "No, send one of the kids."
Yeah.
Because why? What's the implication there?
Yep.
That neighbor is more likely to call the police. There's a black man in my yard.
There's an adult black man in
Right,
my yard.
right. I mean, look what happened to Ahmaud Arbery, right? Or Arbery, however you pronounce that.
Yeah.
He was running, or it was in a construction site, and what, more likely to take the justice into our own hands?
Yes.
So that's not something I experienced. If I were playing with my kids in the street and the ball went somewhere, I would just go get it. In fact, I would say, don't send the kids.
Right.
An
Let me.
adult should go.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
And
It's
yet,
almost the opposite.
it was a different experience because you're less likely to call the cops on a kid.
Right.
I mean, that's an example.
Right.
So,
That's not too dissimilar to the kind of thing that happened in Central. I think it was Central Park with a lady who called 911 on the black guy who was doing nothing in particular just
yes.
a week or so ago.
Yeah.
Similar kind of dynamic.
Right.
So obviously, at some level, very clearly, racism exists in those kinds of ways. Subconscious bias.
Right.
And if we're going to talk about a systematic or institutional racism, which is not exactly a term I love because it's very loaded
Yeah.
in ways that are hard to prove data-wise in some ways. However, when those individual subconscious biases become writ large, you have things that are still happening. And if you're not sure what we're talking about with some like the institutional racism, for example, there was a history of redlining is a term that's talked about. That's sort of like gerrymandering cities and certain neighborhoods would be like green and banks, and this actually has some history in um, up to even 2015 in some small parts of the country here and there of federal government housing programs that would be less likely to give loans or rates to people, favorable rates in the red sections as opposed to green sections. And they would rate parts of the city based on socioeconomic things. And so redlining became a term to talk about that. So that's a form of that kind of institutional racism that has clearly a history
Sure.
and still goes on in some ways.
Yeah. The effects of it in many ways still linger, even if the people in the positions aren't consciously being racist today. That's what's interesting.
Right.
Is you can have the lingering effects.
Right. And that's what some people would call a form of the white privilege you're not even aware of.
Right. You're not aware of it. Right.
That's happening.
Right. And again, it's it's hard to define. That's why it's helpful when we bring up examples here, examples there. People
Yes.
can latch onto it and go,
Yes.
"Oh, I hadn't thought of that. That's an interesting point."
One thing that's been interesting to me is how many people, on the one hand, let me just riff on this for a second. On the one hand, we'll use forms of words like racism, white privilege, um, wokeness, institutional racism, etc., in ways where they're just like this, redlining, etc. And then a number of folks are like, well, wait, I mean, it's just this. I'm not even tracking with any of that. This issue has made clear to me that almost all of our information, and I think this is happening for decades in our country, almost all of our information is mediated.
Sure.
It comes from specific people with specific angles and
Sure.
reasons and purposes um, that people take for granted
Yeah.
often. For example, um, in the early 80s, 50 different companies controlled the media. Now, there's an interesting dynamic now where only five conglomerates control 90% of the media
Wow.
that is consumed. And yet, at the same time, everybody is online with YouTube,
Mm-hmm.
Facebook, etc.,
Mm-hmm.
and those kinds of things.
Yeah, I was just thinking. Remember, we talked about before this when you and I were just praying and preparing for this, that up to the year 2000, in the state of Alabama, I think it was,
Yes,
that interracial marriage was still banned.
right.
And I'm like, well, that's a long time ago. Was it? It was a year before 9/11. How many of you remember where you were at 9/11
Yeah,
happened?
absolutely, right.
This was a year before that. So it's just these things are built in. We can't just say, well, it was all taken care of in the 60s, and Martin Luther King, he took care of all that, and we're good to go. It's not that simple.
Right.
I did want to talk. Can we talk a little bit about the Black Lives Matter?
Yeah,
Can we talk about that a little bit?
yeah, some of the history.
Yeah. You have a question you want to answer? Or?
We have to wait for just a few seconds for a sound issue we need to fix. So give us just a second here. We'll come right back. And now replugging. And maybe you're able to hear us. Maybe you're not. I don't know.
So, so apparently we didn't sound normal. They couldn't hear us.
Are you hearing us now? All right.
Was that a wash, or did you catch most of it?
No, they've been hearing everything up until we just unplugged.
Up until there?
Yep. All
Okay.
right. Go for it.
Okay. All right. So just continuing on it. I want to distinguish a little bit. We talk about Black Lives Matter. We're seeing that everywhere. It's painted on a street, right? So let's engage with that concept. So we do need to distinguish between the truth of the words and what I would say is the movement behind it.
Yes.
The plain meaning of the words is that Black Lives Matter. And I would add the words too. What they're saying by that is Black Lives Matter also. Black Lives Matter too. It doesn't mean Black Lives Matter more or only Black Lives Matter. It means also. So that's the plain meaning of the words. Now, most people use Black Lives Matter in that way, as simply that. And we can all agree on that. They do matter. And why was that raised? Well, it started in what, 2013 in a response to Trayvon Martin's death?
Yeah, primarily. I think that's true. But there's some other history before that. But yeah.
Yes. So we do agree on that. And just to state, we understand why that's being said. It's being said because people feel they have been undervalued, both personally and in society.
Yeah.
And so to say Black Lives Matter is not an attempt to say matters more or matters only, but simply to say also matters.
Yes.
Like children's lives matters or the life of the unborn matters. Okay, so that's the usual way it's used. Right. That's the predominant way in the culture.
Hey, I feel like I feel like saying 60 million babies' lives that have not been accounted for by a very systemic, actually funded by my taxes,
Right.
system of oppression that has murdered
Yeah.
literally tens of millions of babies, predominantly black babies.
I know that's a horrible thing, but yes, that's true. So if we say the life of the unborn matters,
I'm not sure predominantly is the right word there statistically, but yes, sorry, go ahead.
if we say the life of the unborn matters,
Right.
we're not saying only the life of the unborn matters.
Right.
We're just calling out the fact that in some regard, in some way, and for some history, it hasn't been valued.
Yeah.
And so to say Black Lives Matter is at the just the surface cultural level an attempt to say Black Lives Matter and they've been undervalued. If that's what you say when you say it, I get that. I actually said something similar in a post last week, and I just wanted to comment on that. Not
Yeah.
all of you follow me. I get that. But my desire was to highlight the fact that each individual black life is made in God's image and has great value.
Mm-hmm.
So the loss of a single solitary life, like George Floyd, should be mourned as a tragedy.
Sure.
That was my intent. And so I ended by saying, Black Lives Matter. Indeed they do. Everyone.
And I was wondering at the time, are you now into critical race theory?
Right.
Are you into intersectionality?
Sure.
Are you are you all about the social justice that
Sure.
is a word that's a phrase that's been co-opted in ways that are opposed to biblical / God's justice?
And I have had questions asked of me since then.
Right. Yes.
And so this is where we need to clarify. Most people don't know there's an actual Black Lives Matter movement that has its own agenda with its own goals.
Correct. Which is increasingly becoming co-opted
Right.
by a history of what's called critical theory or intersectionality. That's something we can unpack a little
Sure.
bit, but it's worth talking about some for sure today,
Right.
and maybe later on. What were you going to say?
I was
further?
just going to say, so I do not support the broader movement because its ideology and its goals don't align with God. I do support that, as the words themselves in plain English are, Black lives do matter.
Sure.
And that is what I wanted to say. And so let me, if I can just point out a few of the things of the movement,
Yeah.
feel free to jump in. But the movement itself, again, you can look this up on the internet. The movement itself does not have as its goal changing hearts through forgiveness and reconciliation. That is not a goal. And that only comes through Jesus.
It's becoming an identity. It's becoming fully politicized.
It is.
In ways that will not, ironically, help make individual repentance happen.
Yeah, that if you hear nothing else from what we say, we can't solve all ends of this spectrum. We cannot do that, but we can point to the one who can, and that's Jesus Christ. If you hear nothing else, he came to reconcile men to God and to each other.
Yeah.
Period. That is only done through the cross of Jesus Christ. And anything that leaves that out of the formula will fail. It
Right.
will ultimately fail. And so there is no goal of forgiveness and reconciliation that comes through Jesus Christ. In fact, the main goal is to promote black power and change power structures.
Right. There's a sense in which the politicization of it has meant that, and now we're getting into some critical theory. Critical theory basically states it's a form of cultural Marxism, and it was developed in the late 80s in law schools in this country and has begun to take over individual parts of departments throughout higher education, mostly in secular colleges and universities. So critical race theory is a part of a cultural Marxism that says all things are matter and power over powerless. Oppressor versus oppressed is the way the world is defined. And so they would say that, and this has become aligned with much of BLM in ways that, frankly, I don't think most Black Lives Matter folks are even remotely aware of.
No.
But the cultural Marxist critical theory would say only the powerful can be racist.
Right.
And so Black Lives Matter is being functionally, I believe, co-opted in a way that's turning that upside down, doing the same kind of thing in the end. Which is not to say, as we've already established, let's make clear.
Yeah, and we need to keep qualifying here. We know that.
Yes.
So qualify again.
Qualify again. Black lives do matter, because Jesus died for them. And they are made in his image.
critical race theory tends to define everyone by race or class.
Yes.
And
Everyone is a class, a group, not the individual.
Right, not
so
the
you don't
individual.
own property.
Right.
If you're a part of that group or class, it's actually a form of socialism, if you ask me.
Yeah, there's a lot to talk about here. We could talk
There is.
about it more.
We could keep going for a long time. We haven't even talked about intersectionality.
Right, right. So the main goal is to promote a power change. And on the surface, I see why that's appealing. If you have those who have not had power,
Sure.
and you have the hegemony, those who have typically had the power.
Hegemony is a word that's often used in this.
Yes.
The hegemonic means what? What's
It
it mean to be
means
hegemonic?
the dominant culture that's in power.
Yes. And hegemony is the one dominant culture as opposed to
Right.
other homogenies.
So I get it. If I have not had power,
Yes.
then a change in power seems to fix the issue, at least temporarily. But here's the root problem. It doesn't address sin or real evil.
No, it's the world's means.
Right. At best, you flip the tables.
It's the world's means, and it's not gonna do what's hoped.
Right. It's like saying I
It
live
can't. It
for
can't.
vengeance and retaliation.
Right.
Well, that may feel good in the moment. We've all been there.
Yeah.
But no one, when they're calm and rational in talking about these things, feels like vengeance, retaliation, and flipping the tables is the way that produces a better life.
Right.
It may even the score,
Which
but that,
doesn't.
again, is not biblical and
Yes.
ultimately leaves you empty.
Right.
So I just
Let's leave
want
it
to say
there.
that power thing is, but there's a whole lot more to them that a Christian cannot agree with. They're pro-abortion. And as you pointed out earlier, if we say lives matter, and I drop the black just for a minute, well, the unborn has the least power of all.
Absolutely.
So if we are looking for the marginalized in society, they are the most marginalized.
Absolutely.
They have no voice whatsoever.
Yeah.
And the Black Lives Matter movement is very pro-abortion.
Well, and in the similar vein, I would say the number one problem in the world today is fatherlessness.
Yes.
Is the lack of kids having a good model for what a dad looks like and how a dad lives and how they are led by
Huge
fathers
in all cultures and races.
which means that the kids, again, the most powerless,
Right.
are the ones being left behind most in our world today.
Right. Just a couple other things. They heavily promote homosexuality and transgenderism because they redefine sexual ethics. They ignore fatherlessness because they redefine the family.
Yes.
So for those and other reasons, I don't believe Christians should support the goals, of the broader Black Lives Movement. Not saying we shouldn't support Black Lives Matter. Absolutely we should. But the movement and its goals, which are antithetical to God's purposes, we can't tie into that.
And I think a whole bunch of folks are unaware of the things to which they are tying themselves that have been co-opted by forces that they're not aware of.
Right. So I just thought it was important we bring that up. And I've begun watching a black pastor that I think highly of, and he was talking about...
And you all should too, because he's amazing.
Yeah, so his name is Micah Edmondson, and there's
Oh,
another
sorry,
one
that's
called...
not who I was thinking.
I know,
Yeah.
but you were thinking of Vodi Bakum. Or
Vodi Bakum.
Right.
Voddie.
Right. So
Voddie. He's
here's
great.
a couple things I've done in this. Is I've started to listen to voices that are not me.
Yeah.
So I'm following now like 3 or 4 people on Twitter.
You're starting to watch my sermons
Yours,
over and
yes,
over
that's
a
right.
lot, right? Yeah.
Because
A
I
lot of
want-
people saying that lately. Yeah, I just want to listen more to you, Scott.
Well, one of Micah's concerns as a godly black pastor that I appreciate said there's no Christian there's no Christian voice that addresses what BLM is doing. Well, that's the problem of the church.
Right.
That's our job. So Christians, what we need to do, we need to call the Church of Jesus Christ to do 2 things. Strongly affirm the value of every life, born and unborn, black, white, you name it.
Sure.
The value of every life. And then 2, work toward biblical justice that doesn't favor one group over another.
Yep.
That's what the church needs to be doing. And part of what Scott and I are trying to do is call us to that. We're trying to point out where there's error and danger in just being sucked into something that is not defined by God. But we're also trying to point out sin where it exists, both in us personally and in our institutions and our society, and not trying to turn a blind eye to that. So please hear us well when we say that's what we're trying to do. It's a hard thing to accomplish. Scott, I was just, if I could say just a couple things Piper said on this.
Yeah.
So I was reading,
Who's Piper?
John Piper wrote a book called Bloodlines, and he was dealing with this issue. Not primarily because he adopted a black girl into his family, which he did,
Yeah.
but because, and by the way, he's a pastor in Minneapolis,
Yep.
of all places. But he said this, there is no salvation or redemption that comes through blaming. whites blaming blacks or blacks blaming whites. There is overwhelming guilt in every human heart. The root answer to moral disintegration, white and black, is not government help or self-help, but the gospel of Jesus Christ. Now,
Yes.
the gospel of Jesus Christ does not come to this controversy and say, well, you just need personal responsibility. And it doesn't come and say, well, you just need to intervene in the structures and fix them. It doesn't take sides. It calls both sides to repent and believe in Jesus and be born again, and let the glory and the life of Jesus be the supreme issue in our life that drives us. And if you think about, this is again still Piper, the Bible has a word to both. James 1:27, religion that God our Father accepts as pure and faultless is this. What?
Yeah.
To look after orphans and widows in their distress. That's justice in our culture for the downtrodden, the weak, and the oppressed, right?
Yeah.
And to keep oneself from being polluted by the world, which is personal responsibility.
Which is a form of us, in practical terms, doing what is justice that God deserves.
Yes.
So when we do that, it is realizing God is in charge of the universe.
Yeah.
And my resources are given by him to wield them in ways that speak to the truth of who he is.
Yeah. And so Piper ended with these thoughts. He said, we must learn from both sides and bring the gospel to bear on both. The gospel conquers Satan, guilt, pride, hopelessness, inferiority, greed, hate, fear, apathy, racism. It conquers all of it. Mm-hmm. So to be a Christian, here's the call for those of you who define yourselves as Christian. Piper says, live for a biblical cause and need, not earthly comfort. We need Christians who commit themselves to great biblical causes like racial justice,
Sure.
or justice for the unborn.
So let's get to how we get to some racial justice in some practical terms. We have a few questions that have come in.
Yeah.
Let's just answer them as they've come in quickly before we move on. One of them is, I was introduced to the term microaggressions. Sure. Discuss, please. So microaggressions, micro meaning small, aggression meaning like a form of being aggressive.
Yeah.
A microaggression is any form of relatively minor comments or subconscious, not necessarily intentional ways of speaking down to someone.
But nonetheless.
Still something that would be taken as, hey, why are you talking to me like that? Because I'm black?
Right. It's like a little cut.
Sure.
You're not going to die.
Right.
But it's going to hurt.
I think it's just plain a term for the kinds of ways that humans have been doing for all of history, but are now being defined in these racial sort of politicized terms.
Right.
Yeah. So you'll often hear it as a way of saying, from both sides, a microaggression is something that you've said that's hurt me, and you're that unaware. I mean, you need to be woke. And from the other side, those who might understand the term will begin to ridicule it as it's just playground microaggressions, as a way to sort of push it off and not to dismiss it. Right.
And I really, we're trying hard here to not lay blame
right
solely at one side. We're trying to walk the line that God walks, which is Jesus with the fullness of grace and truth. So as far as practical things we can do, Scott, do you want to answer a couple more questions, or do you want to get into that?
There's a question here about whether BLM, Black Lives Matter, is Black Lives Matter a movement that is a proponent of saying God is our creator or maker? I would say no.
No.
Generally.
No.
The movement has been co-opted, and even if there are people within the movement, we would say this about any movement or the church or Christians. So the answer in short terms is no. Black Lives Matter is not claiming God's our maker, therefore Black Lives Matter. Is the platform a no God and evolution? Are they saying no God and evolutionary sort of dynamics are a part of what they're claiming?
Yeah, because the Black Lives Matter movement
Yes.
was started outside of traditional church circles.
Yes.
And does not trace its grounding to biblical theology.
I think it was quickly, it was a form of hashtag activism that quickly became a movement that was co-opted by unbiblical and ungodly dynamics, forces, movements, people who thought, hey, let's use this.
Right. Now, if we can move on from those questions, because I don't want the majority of people listening to say all they did was
Right.
bash the movement of Black Lives Matter.
Well, I got a lot more to say. About
know
all
we
that.
do.
But, who are the recommended pastors? Didn't have my
Okay.
pen ready.
Okay.
That was Vodi Baucham, Voddie, Baucham.
Right.
I think that's right or close enough. If you just search Voddie, pastor, a bunch of good stuff will come up. He's great.
Right. And another one that I listened to, now he is not in the same place as Vodi. So
Yeah.
it's helpful for me to hear from both sides of these black pastors. They're both Christian, they're both godly men, but they have a different perspective on this, and that's Micah Edmondson. So Micah's Mika.
Yeah.
And again, you want to listen and filter everything carefully from everyone. Edmondson, Edmondson.
Yeah.
So Micah actually had 6 suggestions for what we can do to cross this divide. He was actually speaking to mainly white Christians in a church conference, but he said, how can we converse across this divide?
Yeah.
And he suggested 6 things from the Bible that I thought were extremely helpful. So I'll just name these off very quickly. He said cultural empathy. I think it's better to call it cultural compassion, cultural humility, cultural curiosity, cultural courage, cultural agility, and cultural immersion. And just quickly what those are. Compassion is Romans 12:15. Weep with those who weep.
Right.
So do we have compassion for those who are unlike us, who are not suffering like us? Do we? Because it's biblical. Compassion.
And is the George Floyd tragedy something that elicits in us an understanding that there are people who are still suffering from the whatever form of racist biases or
Right.
or even worse?
Which is why I chose, and I'm not saying this is what you should have done or the only way to do it, which is why I posted what I did to basically mourn the life of that one black man, to say, I recognize that was a tragedy. Sure. I weep with those who weep.
Yeah.
Second is cultural humility. So Romans 12:16, never be wise in your own sight. Oh, my goodness. So I'm going to speak to myself. I cannot be a cultural know-it-all who thinks I have nothing to learn from others, which is why, in response to all this, I have started following black pastors on Twitter and watching their sermons, and is making sure that they are godly men for whom the Bible is their source of authority and practice.
Yeah.
And then listening to what they have to say, because I want to have cultural humility. I'm not, however, listening to the world,
Right.
because the world will not get the problem right, and they will not get the solution right.
I think a number of Christians have been relatively unaware of the cultural influences of the world, ironically, in a time when we have more information available.
Right.
The info whelm has meant I can't deal with it.
Right.
I'm just gonna one data point equals a straight line, and that's how I'm going to see the world.
Right.
That's not helpful.
Right. So if you're looking for, Tony Evans would be another one. He's been around for a long time.
He can preach.
Black Baptist preacher from Texas, right?
Dallas.
Dallas.
I think it's Dallas. Yeah.
Right. And he
Oak
comes
Hills
from
Bible Fellowship.
a different theological perspective than either of the other two.
Yeah.
But a godly man nonetheless, worth listening to, and because he's black, has a perspective that I can learn from. So I've watched things by them, follow them on Twitter, learning from them. So third is cultural curiosity. James 1:19. Be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to become angry.
Proverbs 10:19 says, when words are many, transgression is not lacking.
Right. James 3:17. The wisdom from above is open to reason.
I am afraid that the constant info whelm has meant a number of people like I can't listen anymore.
Yeah.
I can't listen anymore.
Right.
And feel unable to be curious.
Yeah.
So I understand the
Sure.
the sort of catatonic. I can't listen anymore.
Cultural.
But I think that's important to
Yeah.
actually, and not just listen to those who are saying we've been experiencing 350 to 400 years of microaggressions, pretty small in the whole span of what they've been
really
experiencing.
experienced.
Yes. So that's obviously worth listening to.
Yeah. Cultural courage, example of Luke 4, when Jesus preached in his hometown, and he was rejected because he said, God has concerns for the Gentiles, and he brought up someone from Sidon, someone from Syrian. Basically, he was attacking ethnocentrism, which is that one's own ethnic group should be treated as superior or privileged.
Right.
And
And
he
by
attacked that.
ethnic group, we don't mean color of one's
No,
skin.
although they can go together, but we don't mean that.
Most people conflate those today, put those together,
Right.
but they're not the same things.
No. Jesus basically was saying, I'm the end of ethnocentrism. The new people of God is not ethnically defined that way.
Right.
Many will come from the east and the west and will take their places at the feast.
Yes.
Talking to the Jews.
Jews and Gentiles, Jews and
Right.
everyone else.
Right.
It's a new humanity, Ephesians 2, that I'm making. I'm
Right.
dividing wall of hostility is going down. Right. Which is to say that biblically, theologically, what God's doing in the world is making for himself a people from every tongue, tribe, and nation.
Yes. Revelation 5.
Yes, Revelation 5. And I would also say a distinction from that is that race is a socially constructed word we use
Sure.
that's confused as ethnicity.
Right. Well, how many races are there?
There's
Scott?
one, because we are all the same color. George Floyd and I are technically the same color biologically. He just happens to have actually more of the color
Right.
than I do. So I think biblically, in the mind of God, in his heart, there is not a black and white. There's not a Jew or Gentile, slave nor free. There's not male nor female. We are all one.
Right. Yep. Last two, cultural agility. So Paul knew his culture well enough to then be the apostle to the Gentiles. He could distinguish between cultural preferences and gospel principles. That's a huge thing.
That's a big one.
And then lastly, cultural immersion. Remember Peter, God asked him to eat like a Gentile to see Cornelius, and
Yes.
then he eventually did it. In Galatians, he was finally eating with the Gentiles. Then when the Judaizers came, he backed off and Paul had to rebuke him. But the point was he immersed himself in the culture to bridge the original gap. The
Yes.
original gap was Jew-Gentile,
Yes.
not black-white.
Right.
So we have lots of examples
And by
from Scripture.
Jew-Gentile, what we mean, at least as he was saying it at the time, is not even an ethnic difference.
No.
What he meant by that was people called of God and those who are now also able to be a part of his family.
Yeah.
So he was even saying at that moment, there are two kinds of people in the world.
Yeah.
Those who are of me, born of me. We talked last week about, I think last week or the week before in Malachi, where it says God is searching out his own kids.
Yeah. Yeah. So just briefly, if we haven't said it, I read Piper's book, and he's talking about structural racism or this institutional idea. It shouldn't really surprise us that racism pervades all part of our society. Why?
Because of sin.
Because sin
This
pervades.
is what people do.
Right. This is what people do.
Tribalism is what people do.
Right. So those of you who may be saying, I don't believe that our culture can be racist or that our systems can be racist because I don't see it. Just think of it from this perspective. It would be astonishing, Piper says, if structural racism were not pervasive in institutions because sin is pervasive. The combination of human sin, the devil who works against us, and an evil world system all collude for pride, greed, fear, lust, and racism in everything that we do as humans.
Yes.
So welcome to the
what
world.
political system is going to fix that?
Right.
What governor, power structure, person, movement, group of people, what social... No, please don't kill me online. What social justice movement is going to fix that?
Right. It has to be Jesus.
It can't possibly happen.
Right. It has to be Jesus. We can make incremental changes and we should work for them. We can see wrongs and we should right them.
Sure.
We should identify where there's injustice and work to fix it. But at the end of the day, without Jesus, all our attempts amount to very little.
Absolutely.
Very little.
Absolutely. We got lots more we could say about lots of things because we frankly have just sort of scratched the surface. There are a couple questions.
Okay.
As Christians, how can we best respond to inflammatory social posts
Okay.
from whatever perspective?
Okay.
Or is it better not to engage?
Okay.
So the wisdom issue of inflammatory social media posts,
Okay.
whether it's from one perspective or the other,
Sure.
or is it better not to engage? I have a friend just this morning posted this very long and very articulate, well thought through. I mean, this person's a thinker. Well thought through, articulate, and I thought, man, that's all good. It's so good. and I thought, who can argue with this? I mean,
Yeah,
people.
right.
And then I noticed, oh my, and it just blew
Sure.
up,
Sure.
blew up.
Sure.
And I thought to myself, it doesn't matter what you're posting. Right now, it is inflammatory.
Sure.
So what do we do? Is it better not to engage?
So can I use a principle from the marriage ministry?
Nope. Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So Beth Ann and I lead
We
the
don't have
marriage
time for
ministry.
this.
I know. Well, I can shorten it.
No, go for it. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so we talk about bad communication patterns that sabotage a marriage relationship between spouses. And there's 4 main ones: withdraw, escalate, negatively interpret, and invalidate.
Yeah.
Is an acronym, weenie. And we say, don't be a weenie in your marriage. It's easy to remember. Withdraw, escalate, negatively interpret, and invalidate.
Mark
Don't
says
be a weenie.
fixing racism is don't be a weenie. Is that?
That's what I'm saying. But can I give that example I talked about?
Go for it.
Okay. So I similarly felt like I don't even want to engage online. What's the point?
Right.
But there's ways to engage that are helpful. So there was a post I saw on Facebook this weekend. I will leave all the names out and won't identify anyone. But a young black woman had posted something that another person, I don't know the black woman, another person that I do know took and put on Facebook. And like, look what this person said.
Right.
And the black woman said, it's the little things, and then listed 11 things that would probably fall into the term of microaggression, or some of them. Some would be bigger.
Yeah.
But it was things like, it's going to a wedding for your white boyfriend's family and being mistaken for someone who is working and being asked to move the tables. It's being the only one in your group of friends shopping who's told you need to leave your bag at the front of the store before you shop.
Right.
Maybe one more. It's your college professor calling you her mulatto. Is that mulatto or mulatto?
Mulatto's fine.
And letting you know she's down because she's what they call a snow bunny.
Right.
Okay. So they listed 11 things like this.
But listen, I have received suffering,
Sure.
and people have communicated things to
Sure.
me in these ways where I've thought, you're totally misunderstanding me, or you're falsely accusing me, or you're putting me in a category of such and such.
Mm-hmm.
Why is my experience any different?
Sorry. So the first response to it, there was
Yeah.
a second one like that.
Yeah.
The first response was, you call that suffering?
Right.
That's just being easily offended.
Right.
But here's the problem. That's invalidation.
Yes.
It's dismissing the other person's experience outright.
Yes, in part because the politicization of the movement right now means the second person feels like, yes, but I've been dismissed too.
Right.
Yes.
So there's the first bad pattern that shows up, invalidation.
Right.
To which the person who was white that had posted it came back and said, hey, this is written by my friend, don't disrespect her, don't dismiss her.
Yeah.
And then that person who originally dismissed it came back and said, you can't imagine my experiences. Like, I've suffered too, people of all color have suffered.
Right.
That is escalating.
Right.
Like, I see your injustice and I'll raise you one.
Right.
Right? So now they've done
You don't know
invalidation.
nothing,
Right.
kid.
Right. Now you've invalidated and you've escalated. To which they came back and said, no, let's listen to what they have to say. Don't just call them easily offended. To which that white person came back again and threw a Bible verse at them. Always very helpful, just to throw a Bible verse at them. At this point, I wanted to do the third of the 3 bad communication patterns. I wanted to withdraw.
Yes.
I wanted to avoid.
Yes.
I wanted nothing to do with this because it felt uncomfortable for me. Because I know the people involved,
Right.
except for the black woman.
Right.
And then, to the credit of the black woman, she responded to that white person and said, I sent you a message in Messenger. I'd love to talk to you personally about your experiences. Be blessed.
Which is something that I think we Christians can do.
Yes.
In a bunch of ways, whether we're the offending parties, whatever, however
Right.
you want to define that, one of the 2 parties that are part of the conversation or not.
Yep.
Hey, I sent you da-da-da.
Let's talk.
And even putting online,
Right.
hey, I PM'd you,
Right.
private messaged you,
Right.
is a helpful way for others to see, things are going on where it's not just this
Yes.
dumpster fire online.
Right. So that, to me, is the opposite of withdrawal. I wanted to withdraw. The young black woman engaged in a personal and
Yeah.
relatable way.
It's great.
And I was impressed.
It's great.
So then, the white person originally posted all the, not the things against it, but was sharing it, came on and said, hey, we all need to learn. We're all racist, or something to that effect.
Right.
And this is where I see the 4th of the negative patterns coming in, or the 4th of the bad communication patterns coming in. And Scott, help me think this through. But basically, we need to be careful we don't negatively interpret everything to be racism. Some is racism.
Sure.
But racism is an internal motivation. It is, here's one of the definitions. It's an implicit or explicit feeling, belief, or practice that values one race over another or devalues one race below another.
Sure.
So if that's what racism it's not based on the interpretation of the one who hears it, but by the internal motivation of the one who said it or did it. Which means they could just be naive, they could be uninformed, they could be unaware, they could be insensitive, or they could just miscommunicate because they're not good with words.
Which is
that could happen. So coming back to the marriage ministry, what we say to spouses is this: motives and response matter. Jesus, 1 Corinthians 13:7, God says love believes all things and hopes all things. That means you give the benefit of the doubt. You don't assume the worst. You believe the best. You don't assume the worst. That's hard.
Sure.
But that's how marriages work, and that's how interpersonal
That's
relationships
how I
work.
approach it with my wife constantly.
I'm sure you do. And the second thing is responses matter. The Bible says a soft answer turns away wrath, and it's a man's glory to overlook an offense. So the first responder controls where the argument goes. Do they respond with anger, or they choose to de-escalate? Why do I bring that up?
Which is where the Christian
Yes.
has a wisdom decision right there.
This is what we have to do. So we have to avoid the 4 bad patterns of communication. All the 11 things that black woman listed, were they all racistly motivated? Is that a word? Motivated out of racism.
Sure.
I have no idea. Because I wasn't
Racially.
there. Racially. Thank
Yes,
you.
yes, yes.
That's a word. I don't know that answer.
Well, and it could have been the circumstance where, say, I know one of those things listed was the woman who comes up and shows me a picture of somebody in her family who has hair just like you.
Right.
And it's something that may feel like...
It may.
Okay, so what you're saying is you have somebody in your family who's black. Okay, great. So I'm black and you're... So,
Right.
Okay, white woman, you feel better about yourself?
Right.
That kind of feeling in that moment. You never know what could have gone on, which is lady takes a picture out of her wallet because she thinks I've been praying for an opportunity to have some relationship with people who are different from me in ways that are godly.
Right. Yeah.
So this person says or does something that comes across
Right.
awkwardly, which... Let's be real. Black people have to deal with all the time.
Sure. Absolutely.
Just as we all do
Yeah.
in various forms.
Right. So what do we do in that case?
Yes. Well, we
so-
extend grace of Jesus.
Right. So what I'm arguing for here is that let's be careful not to negatively interpret. Not saying that this black woman did. I only know one snippet of what she said about that thing. I wasn't there.
Right.
I'm not saying that. But I am calling all of us to choose to give benefit of the doubt and not negatively interpret. What does that look like in a marriage? It means you say, hey, what did you mean when you said this? Because here's
Yes.
what I felt,
Yes.
and here's how I interpreted it.
Yes.
Is that what you meant? And you give the person a chance to say, oh, goodness, no. I'm sorry you heard it that way. Here's what I meant.
That's huge.
Yes.
That's huge. And many people don't take that first step of, hey, here's how I heard that.
Right.
Here's how I'm understanding that.
Right.
What did you mean? What were you thinking? Help me understand.
Right.
My dad uses that phrase all the time. Help me understand. And
I've heard him do that.
and I
But
go,
it's a
I don't
good
want to help
technique.
you understand.
It's a
Yes,
good
it is.
technique.
It absolutely is. Anything about that?
Just the last thing, an example of what that shopkeeper could have done differently.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously her concern was to avoid thievery, but her response was, when I see black people come, I'll make them keep their bags at the front of the store
Right.
where they can't put something in it.
Right.
To do that in a group of friends where all the others are white and they're allowed to keep their bag,
Right.
how harmful and hurtful would that be?
Sure.
I would be humiliated.
You are instantly in the place of having to make sense of a world where that's the case for
Right.
me.
Right. You're just
But-
assuming something about my character and something different about the character of those who are with me because they have a different skin color. So that to me is not a microaggression. That's a serious hurt.
Sure.
I would still encourage talk to that shopkeeper and say, this is how that feels.
That takes some courage, but that's a great
I
step.
know that's hard.
Yeah.
And if you're that shopkeeper and you happen to be watching this,
Sure.
then hear it from the perspective of the young black woman and engage in conversation and maybe change how you handle that.
A few more questions. My husband says he will not support BLM because they support terrorism or something like that. What should I think? I think, unfortunately, the Black Lives Matter movement has partially been infiltrated with other forces that are not as pro-black as they say.
Yeah. Are they more just anti government or anti-control,
Anti-everything.
anti-everything,
Pro their own power.
anarchy.
It's the politicization of it. The question was, my husband says he will not support Black Lives Matter because they support terrorism or something like that. What should I think?
Well, I think we've given reason enough of what the real agenda is of Black Lives Matter, that you don't want to be associated with the movement. But that's not the same thing as not supporting Black lives.
Right. Let's say, for the sake of our discussion, in my opinion, much of what we're seeing of the Black Lives Matter movement has been politicized in a way which differentiates it from some of the motivations, even of those who are continuing to be a part of it, who want to see justice, who want to have reconciliation, who want to see things rectified.
Sure.
You just have to distinguish those things. And I would say that the distinguishing line and factor there is not about Black Lives Matter. It is about people who believe politics can do something that it can't, and that Jesus brings reconciliation between people, that the gospel alone can do that. So I think we needn't worry as much as we think about, do I support Black Lives Matter or not? When we as Christians are understanding our goal every day is the gospel in the world. We needn't continue to parcel out among our friends and people and folks online in these worldly definitions of things as much as we feel like we need to, just because it's online constantly, or because our friends such and such. Sometimes when we're going along with what our friends say we must, it is because we are not distinguishing enough in those relationships the difference between what politics or a movement or the world can and cannot do versus what the gospel can. So I think it cuts all directions in that way. Another question was, what do you do when your child comes back from college and is all for BLM movement, but you know that they don't know what it's really about and they won't listen to you to get the real information? I think a form of what you talked about with the marriage conversation is needed here. I'm going through a couple books with my kids. Books. Right now, one book. There's another book that they don't know we're going through soon. And we're talking about things based on this book. I'm having to step back and let them talk through some things, and try to slowly and carefully and wisely parcel out some things that I'm aware that they don't see.
Sure.
Instead of just going, well, but what about, which I'm ready to do. That's
and I will say I have 3 grown adult kids now, and what I have noticed is they will listen to more of what I have to say if I am not dismissive of their perspective.
Yes.
So young people today, college age, 20s, teens, if we who are older immediately dismiss the perspective that they hear at college, or that their friends have, because they know real people.
Siri thought you were talking to her.
They know real people who are affected by these things. If we are dismissive of that or downplay that, we will lose some of the credibility to speak truth to our own kids and family members. So one of the things I have done is my wife and I have tried to listen first. Quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to become angry.
I'm really good at that.
Learn from trusted sources, not the world. Speak the truth in love.
Yeah.
Apply these marriage principles. It helps if your kids see that you actually don't feel like you know it all, but you are willing to engage in conversation on these things and talk and admit where there's injustice. There is real injustice, so let's deal with it. Let's work toward fixing it. Jesus came. His first message was what? I've come to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, and to set free the captives.
Luke 4.
Right, and the oppressed. And that's the heart of God. And we need to listen to that and then embody that ourselves.
Yes. Okay, a few more questions here. Stop talking so fast, so I am trying to write down stuff. That wasn't really a question. That was an editorial statement, clearly. Just trying to get through as much as we can. Sorry, I'll try to slow down some. We'll probably come back to it next week. We're going to have to talk about...
I have 12 pages of single spaced words with scripture references and ideas.
I
There's
can't tell
too much.
I can't tell you how many hours and hours and hours worth of time and videos and books I've been reading from all manner of people
Yes.
and
Which
sources.
is a suggestion in and of itself right there.
Yes.
That's that cultural curiosity.
Yeah.
Learn.
Okay, so couple comments here. I wish the BLM movement wasn't corrupted by other people. That's a part of what we're trying to say. And I think, let me try to be nice. I think, unfortunately, part of growing up and seeing the world more accurately is to be aware that the brokenness and sin of the world is far more pervasive. Far more pervasive than you could have ever imagined possible when you were young and ready to take the world, which is not a bad impulse. God set eternity in our hearts, Scripture says. But when the world takes over those kinds of things in us, we become tied to some corrupting factors. So even we're in the middle of nowhere, Greenville, Tennessee, and a relatively peaceful protest that was just fine is slightly co-opted by folks bust from the outside who have a particular agenda, and a few other things happen, and suddenly the peaceful thing begins to feel like, oh, this isn't really as peaceful as it started out to be. That happens all the time. And the difference is, the distinguishing factor is Jesus and the gospel, or the ways of the world, the politicization, the identity politics, the things that take us into places we didn't originally think we were going or want to go. For example, critical race theory and intersectionality, I believe, is one of those cultural factors in the world taking Christians and people who want to do some good for the sake of their black brothers and sisters, whether Christians or not, taking some of those folks along a road they didn't want to go in the first place, they end up going. That's just a little bit of a comment on that comment. We just want people to see that black lives do matter and protect them. Christ and racism don't mix.
Amen.
Amen to that, no question. The goal is equity and equality. True, yes. However, I think a couple things about that. Just making some commentary, and we're way beyond our time. We're going to have to go into some of this next week. We're just going to have to talk about some critical race things, some intersectionality, some more biblical, because we didn't really get into enough scriptural stuff. We've got a ton more here to cover, so we'll come back next week. But on the words equality and equity, let me do it from your perspective. I think those words have begun to mean a bit of a different thing here. So equality and equity have a bit of a different connotation now. So equality of opportunity is not the same as equality of outcome. And the word equity is being used now to talk about the what is the outcome side of the equation. So be careful with those terms a little bit. You'll hear people talk about equity, which they mean to say equality of outcome as opposed to equality of opportunity. And that's a distinguishing factor in not just these racial kinds of things, but in a lot of questions related to how societal, cultural things work. Another thing here, any advice for a dark-skinned person who's feeling extremely vulnerable and pressured to speak out?
Yeah, that's hard.
My identity is in Christ and not in my skin color.
Oh, did they say that?
Yeah,
That's fabulous.
Which I think is, you've spoken your own advice wisely.
That's hard, though. You're in a tough place.
Yes.
That
Which I feel, even as a white male 47-year-old pastor in the middle of nowhere, Greenville, Tennessee,
right.
Let alone if I had more color in me.
But you're so right that the answer is our identity is in Jesus Christ. You are a child of God. You are bought with the precious blood of Christ. You were chosen before the foundation of the world. You have been rescued and redeemed and ransomed, and you have a home in heaven forever with the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords, whose love for you is higher, wider, deeper, longer than we can imagine. That is who each one of us is when we've come to know God through Jesus Christ. That is our identity. Having said that, you can then work from a place where you try to speak to both sides. Remember, it's not a both and. We don't just say, well, it's all personal responsibility and there's no structural issues here to work on at all.
Right.
And we don't go to the other side and say, well, it's all structural issues and there's no personal responsibility. If we
Right.
just fix everything from the top down, society will be fine.
There's a sense in which people believe the lie that it's easier to do one of those two things.
Sure.
That's what we're seeing online all over the place.
Right. At the end of the day, the answer still has to be the gospel of Jesus Christ, one-on-one, changing lives individually. And that changes society overall. It still has to be. It doesn't mean in the meantime, we don't look to correct injustice where we see it. We must, because that is who Jesus is. That's the heart of God.
Yeah.
But it does mean at the end of the day, if I don't bring Christ to bear, then I am putting a Band-Aid on a wound that needs amputation.
Yeah. So I think what we've done today is begin to do some introductory stuff that gets at an overview of a number of issues that people are experiencing and feeling and seeing around them right now.
Yeah.
We've given some definition to some things. We've given some practical help
Sure.
for how to manage these
We've
things.
tried.
However, I think some of what we need to do next week is go back to some of these terms
Okay.
to define them quickly, to talk about some things like what is white privilege,
Okay.
what is structural or institutional racism, and make some distinguishing
Sure.
remarks
Oh,
about...
there's a whole nother world out there. What's white fragility? What's virtue signaling?
I have kept myself from talking about virtue signaling this whole time.
I had to learn a new vocabulary in preparation for this. And- anyway,
Yeah, we'll get to that next week. There's a lot more to talk about. We're grateful for you all for jumping in and being a part of this, even though we've gone a little bit long and not been able to get into some of the meat of some things. But thanks for jumping in, asking questions, engaging. It's important for this conversation to continue.
absolutely. Please engage in conversation. Do not withdraw. And be humble in the way that you do so. Be teachable. Learn. Experience what others can tell you. That's what I'm trying to do by following all these different black pastors. What can I learn from them? And then be able to bring that to bear on your own situation.
Well, you're trying to divest yourself of your whiteness?
No, not divest. Oh, that's another term. Divest yourself of your whiteness. Oh. I am trying to understand a perspective of those that I may not naturally understand.
Right. Well, thanks for joining us for Brown Bags of Bibles. We hope this has been helpful. We'll come back next week for George Floyd, racism, riots, and Justice Part 2 of 27. Thanks for joining us. Take care.
Thank you.